I never thought I'd feel this way about someone in my own family, until that moment in the bathroom when his touch lingered just a little too long. My heart raced, and my breath caught as I realized the dangerous tension between us. It started with an innocent favor, but what followed left me questioning everything I thought I knew about boundaries, and myself. I always prided myself on being a strong, independent woman. At 38, I had built a stable life, married for over a decade, and settled into a routine that felt safe, even if it had started to feel dull. My husband, Eric, worked long hours, and while I knew he loved me, the spark we once shared had faded into something more like companionship. Eric and I never had children, but I adored my nephew, Jake. He had been like a son to me ever since his parents' messy divorce left him spending summers at our home. At 24, Jake had grown into a confident, charming young man with an easy smile and a sense of humor that could brighten any room. That day started like any other. I was cleaning out an old closet, lost in nostalgia as I sifted through clothes I hadn't worn in years, tight dresses, low-cut tops, pieces that once made me feel alive and beautiful. On a whim, I decided to try them on, just to remember what it felt like to be desired. I barely had time to admire myself in the mirror before there was a knock at the door. It was Jake, dropping by to fix a leaking faucet like he'd promised. I let him in, brushing off the slight embarrassment I felt at being caught dressed that way. But as the day went on, something shifted. The way he looked at me lingered a little too long. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name, or didn't want to. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, but as he stood in the bathroom, shirt soaked and muscles tense, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in years. I blamed myself, tried to push the thought away. But the look in his eyes told me I wasn't alone in feeling it. From that moment on, the boundaries I had always trusted began to blur, and I found myself standing at the edge of a temptation I wasn't sure I could resist. After that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Jake had looked at me. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, something dangerous. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the tension between us only grew stronger. Jake started coming around more often, offering to help with errands or fix things around the house. At first, I welcomed the company. Eric was working late more than ever, and the loneliness I hadn't admitted to myself before now felt unbearable. Jake filled that void effortlessly, with his easy laughter and casual compliments that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. But then, there were moments that made me question everything. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. His gaze lingered too long, especially when I wore something more fitted or let my hair down. Once, as I leaned over to grab something off the counter, I felt his eyes burn into me, and when I turned around, he didn't even try to look away. There were other signs, too. He started brushing past me in ways that felt too intentional. His fingers would graze my arm. His hand lingered on my back when he leaned in to show me something on my phone. And then one night he showed up unexpectedly. I was in the kitchen, barefoot in a loose robe, sipping wine and cleaning up after dinner. When I heard the knock at the door, my stomach flipped. It was Jake, looking nervous but determined. "Sorry for dropping by so late," he said, stepping inside before I could even respond. I needed to talk to someone." His voice was low, almost strained, and there was something in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. We sat down, and he opened up about feeling lost, about how the people in his life didn't understand him. But it was the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person who could make him feel whole, that left me shaken. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would make the tension disappear. Instead, I felt my heart pounding as his hand brushed against mine on the table. I pulled away, but not before I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. That night, I lay awake, replaying every moment in my head. The way his touch lingered, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the way my body reacted even when I tried to fight it. I knew I was playing with fire, but some part of me didn't want to stop. And as the days passed, I found myself looking forward to his visits, to the way he made me feel, alive, desirable, and dangerously out of control. It started subtly, glances that lingered a second too long, touches that felt accidental but left my skin tingling long after. Jake was always around now, finding excuses to stop by, whether it was to fix a squeaky door or drop off something he claimed I had left at his place. And every visit seemed to push us closer to the edge of something I didn't dare name. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen pouring a glass of wine, he walked in without knocking. My heart jumped. He had never done that before. "Jake," I said, startled. "You scared me." Sorry, he said with an easy smile, but there was something different about him, bolder, more sure of himself. I just needed to see you. I swallowed hard. See me? Yeah. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. You've been on my mind all day. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The air between us thickened, and I felt my pulse quicken as he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was soft, lingering just long enough to make my knees feel weak. You can't look at me like that, I whispered, but my voice betrayed me, trembling with the weight of unspoken desires. Like what? His voice dropped, low and rough, sending shivers down my spine. Like you? I stopped myself, but it was too late. He already knew. His fingers brushed my wrist, and before I could think, he pulled me closer. Tell me to leave, and I will, he said, his breath warm against my skin. But if you don't? I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were screaming at me to stop, but my body betrayed me, leaning into him instead. I can't, I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't pull away. Jake cupped my face, and in that moment, everything I had been trying to fight came crashing down. His lips brushed against mine, soft at first, testing, but when I didn't resist, the kiss deepened, stealing the breath from my lungs. I broke away, guilt immediately flooding my chest. We can't do this, I said, stepping back. It's wrong. Then why does it feel so right? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I had no answer. I couldn't explain the way he made me feel, alive, wanted, beautiful. It was something I hadn't felt in years, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, I craved it. Over the next few weeks, things only escalated. He started finding excuses to touch me, a hand on the small of my back as he passed by, fingers brushing against mine when he handed me something. Each touch sent sparks through me, and despite my guilt, I couldn't bring myself to stop him. One night, he showed up late again, this time with a bottle of wine. I thought you could use some company, he said, his smile disarming as always. We sat on the couch, the tension between us almost unbearable. He leaned in, brushing my hair back and trailing his fingers down my arm. You're so beautiful, he said softly. Jake, I started, but he silenced me with a kiss, gentle at first, then hungry and demanding. I knew I should stop him. I knew I should push him away. But instead, I let him pull me closer, my body responding to him in ways I couldn't control. That night, everything changed. The boundaries we had been trying so hard to maintain shattered completely. The guilt came later, but in that moment, nothing else mattered except the way he made me feel. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret touches. We couldn't stay away from each other, even though we both knew it was dangerous. But the closer we got, the more the reality of what we were doing began to set in. Every time I looked at him, I saw the risk, the possibility of being caught, the damage we could do to our family, to ourselves. And yet, I couldn't stop. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that it would pass, but every time he touched me, every time he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world, I fell deeper. I knew we couldn't keep this up forever, but I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. It all came crashing down on a night that started out just like any other. Jake had come over again, and as usual, we pretended it was casual, just two people sharing a glass of wine and easy conversation. But underneath it all, the tension simmered, threatening to boil over. That evening, he lingered longer than usual. We were sitting close on the couch, and I could feel the heat radiating off his body. His hand rested on my knee, and though I told myself to move it, I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him. He turned toward me, his eyes dark and intense. You're all I think about, he said softly, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. I knew what was about to happen, but I didn't stop it. When his lips found mine, all the guilt, all the doubts melted away. I pulled him closer, letting myself get lost in him. But then a sound shattered the moment, a key turning in the lock. Panic shot through me as the front door creaked open. My heart stopped. It was Eric. Jake jumped up, backing away as if he'd been burned, but it was too late. Eric stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on us, and the look on his face sent ice through my veins. What the hell is going on here? His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but there was nothing I could say that would make this okay. Jake stepped forward. It's not what it looks like, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Eric's eyes narrowed, and the hurt in them cut deeper than any anger ever could. Not what it looks like, he repeated, his voice shaking. I come home early to surprise my wife, and I find her practically draped over my nephew? Explain to me how that's not what it looks like. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. Eric, please let me explain. Explain. He let out a bitter laugh. I don't think there's anything you could say right now that I'd want to hear. Jake tried to step closer, but Eric held up a hand to stop him. You get out, he snapped. Jake hesitated, looking at me as if he wanted me to stop him, but I couldn't. I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. Go, Jake, I said softly, and the look of betrayal on his face broke something inside me. When the door slammed shut behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. Eric turned back to me, his expression unreadable. How long? He asked quietly. I swallowed hard. It wasn't. Don't lie to me, he snapped, his voice cracking. Tears streamed down my face. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said. I swear I didn't. But it did, he said. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked defeated. I trusted you. I stepped closer, desperate to fix what I had broken, but he moved away. I need time, he said, his voice hollow. Time to figure out if I can ever forgive you for this. And then he walked away, leaving me alone with my guilt. The days that followed were a blur. Jake tried to call me, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I needed space to think, to sort out the mess I had made of my life. Eric stayed in the guest room, barely speaking to me. I could see the pain in his eyes every time he looked at me, and it tore me apart. Jake, on the other hand, refused to give up. He showed up at the house one night, standing outside in the rain like something out of a movie. I love you, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I don't care what anyone thinks. I'll wait for you, for as long as it takes. My heart ached at his words, but I knew I couldn't let him keep holding on to something that was doomed. No, Jake, I said firmly, even as tears streamed down my face. We can't do this. But I'm sorry. My voice broke, but I forced myself to continue. You deserve better than this, better than me. He didn't argue. He just looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with pain, and walked away. For weeks, I lived in limbo, trying to repair what was left of my marriage while battling the part of me that still longed for Jake. Eric eventually agreed to counseling, and slowly we began to rebuild. But no matter how much progress we made, I couldn't shake the memory of what I had done, or the feelings I had tried so hard to bury. Jake moved away, and the last I heard, he was seeing someone new. I told myself it was for the best, but a part of me would always wonder what might have been if things had played out differently. The house felt colder after that night. Eric stayed, but the distance between us grew unbearable. He moved into the guest room, barely acknowledging my presence except for brief, hollow conversations about bills or groceries. I tried to act normal, cooked his favorite meals, left notes on the fridge like I used to, but nothing could erase the look in his eyes when he saw me. It wasn't anger anymore. It was worse. It was emptiness. I hated myself for hurting him, for destroying the trust we had built over the years. But even as guilt gnawed at me, a part of me still longed for Jake. I kept replaying that last moment, his rain-soaked silhouette, the desperation in his voice. I'd told him to move on, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I had meant it. One evening, Eric broke the silence. Do you love him? His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he set his coffee mug down. No, I said immediately, but the hesitation in my voice betrayed me. He looked up, eyes filled with pain. You don't even believe that. Tears welled up as I shook my head. It wasn't love. It was a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake. But it didn't mean anything. You mean everything to me. He leaned back, folding his arms. If I mean everything, then why wasn't I enough? The words cut through me like a knife. I don't know, I whispered, ashamed. I didn't plan this, Eric. I didn't want it. But you didn't stop it either, he said bitterly, and the truth in his words left me hollow. As the weeks passed, Eric became more distant. He started working late, sometimes not coming home at all. I didn't ask where he was. I was too afraid of the answer. I tried to distract myself, joined a gym, took up painting again, but nothing could drown out the ache inside me. And then one day I saw Jake. I was at the grocery store, standing in line when I spotted him by the produce section. He looked different, stronger, more confident. And he wasn't alone. A pretty brunette laughed beside him, touching his arm in a way that made my stomach twist. I froze, unsure whether to run or say something, but he saw me first. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he gave me a small, sad smile and turned back to the woman. I should have felt relief, but instead it felt like a punch to the gut. That night I broke down. Eric found me sitting on the floor of the bedroom, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in weeks, he sat beside me. I can't keep doing this, I said through sobs. I can't keep pretending like I'm fine. He He didn't speak, just took my hand and squeezed it gently. I hate what I did to us, I continued. But I hate myself even more for wanting something I knew was wrong. He sighed, his voice softer than it had been in months. We both made mistakes, Claire. Maybe not the same kind, but mistakes all the same. I looked up, confused. What do you mean? He hesitated. I let things fall apart. I stopped trying. I stopped making you feel loved. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I knew he was right. We had both let the cracks grow too wide before we noticed. But even that realization didn't change the damage that had been done. We went to counseling, hoping to salvage what was left of our marriage. Some days felt like progress, others like we were just delaying the inevitable. And Jake, he was gone, out of my life but never far from my thoughts. I knew it was better this way, but I couldn't deny the impact he'd had on me. He had reminded me of who I used to be, the woman who felt desirable and alive. But he had also shown me how fragile everything I thought was secure could be. Months passed, and eventually, Eric and I decided to separate. The wounds were too deep, and no amount of therapy could heal them completely. I moved into a smaller apartment, trading the spacious home we had shared for something simpler. It felt lonely at first, but it also felt like a fresh start. As for Jake, I never saw him again. I heard through family that he was engaged, and while it hurt at first, I was genuinely happy for him. He deserved someone who could give him everything, and I hoped she could. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the loneliness crept in, I sometimes wondered if he ever thought of me the way I still thought of him. I would never know, and maybe that was for the best. Months turned into a year, and life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy, or at least something close to it. I settled into my new apartment, learned to enjoy the quiet, and focused on rebuilding myself. But no matter how far I tried to move forward, echoes of the past lingered like shadows that refused to fade. I often thought about Jake, not with longing, but with a bittersweet ache. He had been a part of me during one of the most vulnerable chapters of my life, and no matter how wrong it was, it had forced me to confront truths I had ignored for too long. I realized that what happened with Jake wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the parts of myself I had buried beneath years of routine and neglect. I had let my sense of identity fade, becoming a wife, a caretaker, and someone who put everyone else's needs before her own. Jake hadn't just awakened forbidden feelings, he had reminded me of who I used to be, the woman who wanted to feel desired, alive, and seen. But in the end, the cost of chasing that feeling had been too high. Eric and I finalized our divorce quietly, without drama or bitterness. By then, we had both come to terms with the fact that our marriage was broken long before Jake ever came into the picture. We remained cordial, but we stopped pretending we could go back to the way things were. I saw Eric a few months later at a mutual friend's gathering. He looked happier, lighter, even, and I felt a sense of peace knowing he had begun to move on. It made me realize that letting go hadn't just freed him, it had freed me too. As for Jake, I never reached out. I thought about it, especially during the loneliest nights, but I knew it wasn't fair to reopen wounds that had just started to heal. I heard through family that he was married now, and although a part of me felt a pang of sadness, I was genuinely happy for him. He deserved a fresh start, and so did I. I learned the hard way that love, or what feels like love, can sometimes be a disguise for emptiness. And filling that void with the wrong person only leaves it emptier when it's over. Looking back, I don't regret the choices that led me here, not entirely. They forced me to face truths I had been too afraid to confront, and they pushed me to grow in ways I never thought possible. But I do regret the hurt I caused, the trust one shattered, the hearts I broke. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that boundaries exist for a reason. They protect not only our relationships but also our sense of self. Crossing them might feel thrilling in the moment, but the aftermath is rarely worth the damage. I also learned that desire isn't the same as love. Love is steady and enduring. It's not just sparks and stolen moments. What I had with Jake wasn't love, it was escape, and no escape lasts forever. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone different, not broken, but stronger. I've learned to love myself again, not because someone else made me feel beautiful, but because I learned to find beauty in my flaws. And while I'll always carry the memory of what happened, I refuse to let it define me. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone standing on the edge of temptation, it would be this: pause. Think about what you're risking, not just what you're craving. Passion fades, but the consequences last. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. What would you have done in her situation? Was it temptation, love, or just a desperate cry for attention? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shocking and emotional tales like this one. Stay tuned. There's more drama coming soon.